Hey, it's Clark with Pass the Baton. Just want to talk about a story. It's a familiar story, but you know how sometimes you hear those stories, from the Bible several times in your life, like the Garden of Gethsemane, and you hear the story about one of the disciples cutting off somebody's ear, and you hear different stories along those lines, around Easter and all those things, but you never really connect them. And as I was studying the Garden of Gethsemane, I kind of connected that story in a different way. And it lets me see a little bit more about what's going through Peter's mind as this happens. Now, in all the Gospels, there's a little bit mentioned about this story. The book of John, literally over half of the book of John, is about this last week of Jesus' life. But yet, the story about the Garden of Gethsemane takes up one verse. Literally, just as passing says that he's there. And then you see the events that take place after. Now, in Matthew, you have like 15 or so. I didn't actually count them, but a lot. And Matthew and Mark and Luke as well, it's kind of a bigger story about the Garden of Gethsemane. And this is, after the Last Supper, and Judas literally leaves, and we know, now we know looking back that he was going away because he's going to, turn Jesus in, so to speak. He's going to kiss him. He's going to betray him, and so that's going on. And so Jesus then he walks across the brook, the Kidron brook, toward the Mount of Olives, and he's going there with all his disciples. And he gets over a certain way, and he looks at all of them but three, and he says, "You guys stay here." And then he takes Peter, James, and John into the garden a little bit further in, and then he literally looks at them, Peter, James, and John. He says, "Okay, I must go a little bit farther, or a little further." And one of the Gospels literally says he goes about a stone's throw away, so he's close to them. Luke says that literally he was in such agony that he prayed and his sweat was like it was great drops of blood. So this was a stressful time. It was a horrible time. It was a time when Jesus knew what he was going to face. He knew that the cup was coming. He literally says, "Father, if it's possible, please take this cup from me." And of course, we know God's will, and Jesus was willing to do the will of his Father. And so he was willing to take that cup meaning our sins, yours and mine. He was willing to do that. And he decided this at the Garden of Gethsemane. But while he's there, getting ready to make this decision, and literally, I believe Jesus could have decided not to do it. Now, yes, we know God's foreordained all this to happen. We know all that. But the book of John says literally, I could have not given my life. In so many words, he says that. I think chapter 18, one down toward the end. But he could have not done what he did. But he decided that yes, I'm going to give my life for you guys. He decided that at the Garden of Gethsemane, under all the stress, under all these things going on, he decides that. But while he's praying, while he's in agony, and he looks at Peter, James, and John, and he literally says, "Guys, you all fell asleep. Couldn't you watch for 1 hour? Couldn't you just? I mean, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Said, "Pray that you enter not into temptation." Meaning that proving time, whatever, just can't you just literally get it just for a little while? Now, no doubt, like Peter, James, and John, I'm sure Peter especially, we know how impetuous he was, we know how zealous Peter was. No doubt he had a little guilt about that, thinking, I can't believe I couldn't even. I mean, you see when Jesus walks back to him and literally he's sweating blood. No doubt, no doubt this was a serious time, and they understood that. No doubt Peter felt some guilt about that. So, as literally the Gospels tell us, immediately thereafter, then the Pharisees come with Judas. Judas kisses Jesus and betrays him, so they all know who he is, and they're taking him away. Now, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we read that detail when we read that a disciple cut off somebody's ear. That's really all we know about it, other than that Jesus takes the ear, puts it back on. Now, in John, he's writing. This is all he says about the Garden of Gethsemane. When Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the brook Kidron, where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. Now, Judas betrayed him. Now, that's the extent of the garden. It doesn't talk about him praying, doesn't talk about any of these things. But we know from the other Gospels how intense this prayer was, how stressful, how important this part was, and how Peter was one of these disciples that literally sat there thinking, I can't believe it. Here I am falling asleep. And he's come to me and says, can't you watch? And 3 times he does this. So Peter's feeling that. He understands it when Jesus said, watch, which means literally to look, to scope it out, to see what's going on. I think Jesus probably even wanted to protect it. I mean, that was part of it. It wasn't just that they could see and pray. He understood what was going on. He knew these people were looking for him. He knew Judas went to get him, and he says, watch. So it makes it a little easier to understand Peter's zealousness, if that's a word. When they come, they lay hands on Jesus, they're taking him away, and says, verse 10 in chapter 18 of John, then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it, and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. Now, I've never really thought about it. Not that people in my life haven't connected these stories when they're preaching or talking about it, but I just never thought about it. It's one of those undesigned coincidences that you hear about in apologetics. There are so many people to try to discredit the Gospels. They try to say all these things, but literally, when we put them together, it makes this make a much better picture of what's going on. If you just read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you understand what was going on with Peter, James, and John, but you don't know that Peter's the one that cuts his ear off. We're not told. But if you only read John, you don't get all this about Jesus praying and about telling them to wait and watch. You have to put them together. It's an undesigned coincidence. It's one of those things that's be like, oh man, that makes sense. I understand why Peter was feeling so just into it. That he's like, okay, I'm going to make up for this. I'm going to make up for the fact I fell asleep. I wasn't watching. And he's thinking, this is what Jesus was worried about. I'm going to take care of it. I got you, Jesus. And it's easy for us to just look down on Peter for doing this. But literally, even Jesus really, I mean, he just says, no, don't you know I'm supposed to take this cup? He doesn't overly get onto him. He doesn't really, discipline him or anything like that. He just says, he just fixes it. And it's that situation where John Lennox has talked about when you use violence, you cut the ears off people. In other words, they won't listen to you. And if you're violent or even mean or mad, which, hey, we've all done, the chances of that person actually listening to you and wanting to hear what you have to say is it's not very, very big chance. And so here, when we put these together, we understand, and it's just like when I was studying about Gethsemane, about a message I'm going to be preaching at church, and it's just like, I know now why Peter did that. It makes so much more sense. And here he is. He's just like, he's just been through this garden experience. He's watched this with Jesus, and he's like, okay, this must be why you wanted me here. And so it's easy for us to just look down on him, but Peter was just a guy that was doing what he thought he was supposed to do. He had a lot of energy. He was overly zealous. I'm not sure what I would have done, but I do see what Peter did, and I understand it a little bit. Now, Jesus doesn't want us to be violent. I truly believe that, and I think this is just one of those stories that helps create that. But we can at least see, I think, Peter was literally just doing what he thought he was supposed to do, I believe, in this instance. And furthermore, this story, putting it together, helps solidify these gospels, and that they're written, by the inspiration of God. They're all put together, and they just make sense. That's what makes this story so neat, and at least myself, allowed me to look at the story about a disciple cutting off somebody's ear a little bit differently. So I hope you've learned a little bit from it. Understand how important that Garden of Gethsemane was, that the crushing, the pressure that Jesus had to go through there, literally, to bring him to that point where he gave his life. And the crushing that we have to go through in our life, it brings us to a certain point as well. But we can see why Peter, going through this as well, is like, okay, this is not happening. I'm going to take care of this. Thoughts? Please put them on the YouTube link. Let me know what you think. Read through John chapter 18. It's a great place to look at this story. Until next time.